This is a workshop on what your rights are as a tenant, and as the title suggests, how to fix issues in your building. This is presented by the Oakwood Vaughan Community Organization, as well as CP Planning, which works very closely with OVCO. So just a quick itinerary here. We're going to be doing the introduction slides, which we're going through now. We're going to be talking then about what your rights are. After that, we're going to have a quick break. People can get some snacks. People can come together. We're going to have a quick discussion. After that, just how to exercise your rights, which is, I think, a pretty clear follow-up. We're going to have a question and answer periods. Then we're going to talk about tenant associations, and we have 2 guest speakers for that. And then a quick wrap-up. One thing I will say right off the bat is that this is a workshop. This isn't a lecture. So we do want this to be interactive. If anyone has any questions, just raise your hand and I'll try and get to it as soon as possible. The only thing I will say about that is try and be respectful of everyone's time, and not to be rude when I say this, but do try and get to the point. We do have a lot of people here. There's going to be a lot of questions, a lot of things to cover. So we just want to be to the point, you know? First thing I will do is a land acknowledgement. More accurately, I would say this is a history acknowledgement, a history that continues to this day. We are on the lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. We are under the authority of what is known as the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, which was a treaty that bound the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee to share and protect the land. Europeans and newcomers were invited to live under this treaty, but the colonizers had other ideas. The clearing of the land for settlement saw the ongoing genocide of indigenous peoples, from the Indian agents to the pass system, from residential schools to the underhoused and incarcerated. We, the newcomers, did not honor the dish with one spoon. Where other nations honored their relationship with the land, we saw land as property, as a resource, as something to be extracted. And as tenants, we know how harmful this extraction can be. We're here tonight because we believe in a form of community, of sharing, of peace, one that's stronger than any colonial state. Thank you. Just a quick overview of who we are. OVCO, the Oakwood Vaughan Community Organization, is a resident-led nonprofit. By resident-led, pardon me, I mean we are members of the community. We live here. We're not getting paid for this work generally, like well, I am. That's an exception. Pardon me, but yeah, we're all just community members. What we're trying to do is advocate on behalf of the community, as the community, and for the community. And how we do that is through 2 different main projects. The community plan and working groups. Working groups seek to change policy in the community in a way, change and influence policy in the community in a way that benefits all of us. And the Tenant Solidarity program is what my focus is on. My role in OVCO is a tenant organizer, and I do things like this. So that's what this program does. Bill Worrell is actually the chair, and he can actually speak on this just really quickly. Hi, Bill.
Hi. So can everybody hear me, or do I need to talk in the mic? Okay. So yeah, I'm Bill Worrell. I've lived in this.
Bill, sorry, could you speak in the mic just for people on Zoom?
Oh, on Zoom.
Yeah, it might be easier to pick up.
Yeah, so there's people on Zoom, by the way. They're not in this room, but
but that's okay. So just to continue what Bill was saying really quickly, as OVCO, this part of the map is where we represent. So the reason I'm bringing this up is that if you live within this boundary, this is Eglinton up here. It extends a bit north past Eglinton. You can see some major intersections here. Vaughan Road is there. Oakwood is here. Just to give you an idea of the map, if you live within this boundary, we can help you, and we will help you. We are limited in terms of our reach. This is the community we represent and try and work within. Anyone outside this boundary is welcome to be here at this workshop, is welcome to attend our presentations on Zoom or in person. But in terms of helping you establish a tenant association, in terms of helping you fight against a landlord doing something illegal, unfortunately, we can only help you if you're within this boundary. So if you are, please do get involved in OVCO if you can in any way, and we would love to help you. So the space we're in right now is a nonprofit called the For Youth Initiative. The For Youth Initiative has been incredibly kind in letting us use their space, so definitely need to give them a shout out here. They seek to help youth in their community. Quite simple. There's a lot of text here. They focus on youth as individuals, meeting them where they are and trying to get them resources and help that they need. They actually help anyone between the ages of 12 and 29. They do a lot of work with high school, enrolling in post-secondary education, gaining employment. They do a lot of incredible work. So I'm very happy that we can work together on them on this workshop. I'm very happy everyone can be here at their space. And yeah, definitely look into them for anyone that is between 12 and 29 or knows someone between 12 and 29. They do a lot of fantastic work. As mentioned, we can help people in this community, and we would love to do that. If you see anything in this presentation you'd like to get in touch with us about, if you learn something that you want to talk about, if you have an issue you want to talk with us about, these are the ways you can get in touch. I'm the tenant organizer, so this is my personal email. This is the email I use through OVCO. You can contact me through any of them. OVCO also has an email that the board of directors use, and there's also our website you can check us out at. I didn't want this slide to get bogged down. We also have an Instagram page and some other things, but these are the important contact lists. And yeah, without further ado, thanks for getting through the introductions with me. We're going to do the Know Your Rights part of the seminar, and please, this is, yeah, if you have any questions at any point, just raise your hand. So the first thing I'll say is that most rights in Ontario, at least, if you're a tenant, stem from something called the Residential Tenancies Act. This is something really important to know because this is what governs pretty much anything about your rights as a tenant. So if you actually, there are some exceptions. If you live in a condo, if you're something called a boarder, which means you live with the landlord or you share a common space with the landlord or a close friend of theirs, close family member of theirs, these laws don't apply to you. Something also important to know about the RTA is that it is not a rights-based framework. And what I mean by that is that this is not legislature that was established to make sure tenants have hot water, to make sure tenants have clean apartments. This is legislature that was put in place in a very legal sense. It's put in place to govern the relationship between a landlord and a tenant. It explicitly says the rights and obligations of tenants, the rights and obligations of landlords. This is an important point because the law itself kind of views landlords and tenants on the same plane. I would say as a tenant myself, and I'm assuming a lot of people in here are tenants, that we kind of know that this isn't necessarily right. So this is kind of important in terms of how we think of the law, how we approach trying to get our rights met. So I will ask everyone to kind of bear that in mind, not only for this presentation, just also whenever you have an issue and try and see it done, like this does really play out in a very real way for a lot of tenants. With that being said, though, the first section we're going to talk about is repairs and maintenance. So there's a lot of things to cover here, but the quick overview, and everyone has it on their slide sheet, so I'm not necessarily going to say everything verbatim on the slide. But landlords are responsible for keeping a lot of things in your unit in good working order. There are exceptions. If you take a hammer to your fridge, your landlord doesn't need to fix that. If your fridge breaks after 5 years of living there from normal wear and tear, though, your landlord will need to replace that. That is their obligation. Things like the floors, windows, ceilings. If you move into a unit and there's a hole in the wall, that's still your landlord's responsibility to fix it, even if you moved in when it was already there. Any appliance that was in the unit when you moved in is also your landlord's responsibility. One thing to note about this is that you need to make a request first, and there needs to be a reasonable amount of time for your landlord to fix it. So a hole in the wall, a reasonable amount of time. This is ballpark, this is not legal advice per se, but you might expect like 2 to 4 weeks maybe as like a reasonable amount of time. But something else, like for example, a lack of hot water or electricity, these are vital services. So a reasonable amount of time, a quote unquote reasonable amount of time, is very different in that case. We're going to be talking later about how to actually exercise your rights. But just because it's very important, I will say, if you are missing out on a vital service, if you don't have hot water in your unit or electricity and your landlord's not very quickly making repairs, you can call something called property standards at 311 and explain the situation, and they can help you with that. Next, we're going to talk about rents. I know very certainly that in our community, at some of the apartment buildings on Winona, that there are illegal above guideline rent increases. So in Ontario, the RTA has something called rent control in it. There is a mandate, a maximum amount that your landlord can raise your rent every single year. So this only applies to buildings constructed before 2018, unfortunately. If you live in a building built after 2018, this won't apply to you, unfortunately. If you do live in the community on one of the apartment buildings on Winona, for example, I know a lot of people from there are out here, so thanks for coming, but this will apply to you, for example. So 2021 was obviously a very important year for COVID. So rent increases were capped at 0%. A landlord could not increase your rent then. For 2022, this upcoming year, the maximum your landlord can increase your rent is 1.2%. Before these increases can take effect, you must be given 90 days notice. And another thing to say about this that's very important is that the yearly increases apply not on January 1st, but on a year after you moved in. So for example, if someone in here moved in on June 1st into their unit, June 1st of this past year, your 2022 rent increase applies June 1st of next year. So your landlord can raise your rent 1.2% in June, not in January, despite the fact that it's for 2022, right? If you do have a landlord trying to illegally raise your rents, which unfortunately happens a lot, you will have a full year to contest it. And the terms contest in this case, what that means is that you'll be able to raise an issue. It doesn't mean that you need to get like a court date and get it resolved in a year. It means you need to apply for a court date within a year, is basically what that means. So if after 360 days, you call up your landlord and say, hey, this is baloney, my rent shouldn't be this high, you can then apply to the landlord tenant board, and they'll probably set a hearing out in a couple weeks or a couple months. But because you initially contested it before a year's time, you'll be able to get back pay on that. Now, one thing to be clear about this is that if you don't contest it, it just becomes your current rent. It just is that. I don't agree with that law. I just want it to recognize that's what it is, and we need, as tenants, we need to be aware of that. The only other thing I'll say about this is that there are exceptions. For example, if the building you live in, if the property tax increases significantly, or if the landlord makes major renovations, then landlords can apply for above guideline rent increases, but they will need to prove to you that they got an order from the landlord tenant board that allowed them to do it. Otherwise, you don't have to pay that, and you can contest it at the landlord tenant board, or you can escalate it, legally speaking. It's getting real cold right now. We're going to talk about heat next. This is something I've experienced. I don't know how many other people have experienced this in here. I have experienced units that are not as hot as they should be. So there are standards for how hot your place needs to be. This varies from city to city. So the people on Zoom, I would recommend checking out your own city's guidelines on this if people are in other cities. In Toronto, between September 15th and June 1st, your landlord needs to ensure, it's the law, they have to make sure that you can heat your unit to 21 degrees Celsius if you so choose to. If you like the cold, you don't need to, but you need to be able to have the option. As I mentioned before, this is a vital service. It cannot be turned off for any reason ever, full stop. You cannot pay rent for 4 months. you still are entitled to have your unit hot. And yeah, I saw a question at the back.
What if it's too hot?
If it's too hot,
I'm not just saying, you know, a little bit. Really overheated.
Mhm.
And I asked him, you know, could you please do something? Could you please lower it down a little bit? And I know that they can lower it.
Mhm.
He hasn't.
So one thing I'll say about I promise you I'll answer your question. I'm going to go on a quick tangent and get back to it. Just for people on Zoom, the question was, what if your unit is too hot, and not just by a few degrees, but this person's unit seems to be significantly, like, uncomfortably hot. So I will say, back to talking about the Residential Tenancies Act, this was legislature that was not written by tenants. And what I mean by that is that it tries to be comprehensive, but it's done in a way where it very clearly isn't. And I'll give you an example of my own experience. With 3 roommates, I'm renting the top 2 floors of a house right now. The landlord lives in the basement, and we've signed a lease that says we paid 2/3 of the utility bill. Now, the issue with this is that our landlord doesn't provide us the utilities. He tells us at the end of the year what the entire utility bill for the entire year was. We've asked him several times to tell us on a monthly basis. So we basically just get hit with this big bill at the end of the year, and he doesn't really provide receipts. So we're not even sure if he's telling us the real number or gouging us. The reason I bring this story up is because there's nothing in the Residential Tenancies Act that says he can't do this. This is one of those cases on utilities where we're living in a very unique situation where the Residential Tenancies Act doesn't actually cover this. So to answer your question, I'm not entirely sure if the Residential Tenancies Act covers this specifically. I do know that there are things you can contest. You are entitled to, the term is reasonable enjoyment of your unit. And if for whatever reason you're not experiencing that, and this is a very valid complaint, this is something that the landlord is responsible for controlling, you can actually contest that on the grounds of this not allowing you to reasonably enjoy your unit, which it sounds like it's very much not. So we'll talk about that later on, about what that looks like, how to actually contest that. But just to answer your question, like, this specifically won't necessarily cover your situation, but you absolutely should not be living in that situation. Your landlord absolutely should be doing something about this.
I don't know what else to do. I'm putting work orders. Every time I see him, I don't know what to do. And there's a couple of other things as well, important things.
So just for reference on Zoom, the person I was speaking to has said that the landlord just hasn't done anything despite work orders, despite requests for work orders. And to answer that, it's very difficult. Sometimes landlords will just ignore the work orders. They'll just ignore your requests. And it's not always easy to contest. So we will get to this. There's options like calling your counselor. There's options like calling property standards. If you haven't, it sounds like you may have, given you mentioned work orders. And if it escalates, you can even call the landlord tenant board. Talk to them, even legal clinics you can get in touch with. We will be addressing this in the second part of the presentation, and you can come speak to me during the break if you'd like to. But I do think it's prudent to move on. So just getting back to this slide, as mentioned, heat is a vital service, and also thank you for the question. This is an important part of the workshop. But yeah, heat is a vital service, so you can never be refused. This is the point. Again, you can call property standards and call 311 and report this as a vital services violation if your unit is under 21 degrees Celsius. And if this does happen to you, make sure to use the term vital service violation. That's a very important term in this case. Has anyone here ever experienced landlord harassment? I see at least 2 hands. I'm going to be the 3rd hand. Many hands coming up. It's unfortunate. In my case, I'm sure this is going to be quite relatable, and I'm not happy about that. I just recognize it as true, is that in my case, I was harassed by my landlord because I had the audacity, the gall, to ask for the bare minimum of legal repairs I was entitled to. So unfortunately, this happens. And just to be entirely clear about what your rights are if it does happen, just to be entirely clear, your landlord isn't allowed to harass you. They can't do that. They can never do that. They can't threaten you. They can't scream at you. They can't invade your privacy. Your landlord also must make sure no one working on their behalf can do any of those things. So a superintendent or a property manager, I won't name names, I won't speak on anyone else's behalf, but I do know that there was someone that there is a building in our community where there was an incredibly racist property manager. So this stuff does happen, and the landlord's responsible for making sure it doesn't happen. In some cases, your landlord might even be responsible for ensuring that other tenants don't harass you. So for example, if you live next door to someone that has been harassing you, that threatens you, maybe they kick in your door or something, in many cases, it'll be your landlord's responsibility not to necessarily physically intervene, but tell this person to stop, to try and mediate it. In some extreme cases, unfortunately, I don't think this is a net good for the world, but I understand that in the world we live in, it might be necessary for your landlord to actually issue an eviction on that person if they're making your building unsafe for you. So there are things that landlords have the responsibility to do to make sure we're safe, even from other people in our buildings. There are some examples of what constitutes harassment. We've talked about yelling. One thing I really think is important to mention is that your landlord cannot harass you or discriminate against you. Discriminating against you would count as harassment on the basis of something that's a protected class. So in Ontario, there's protected classes and creeds. Some of those, for example, are your sexual orientation, your religious affiliation, your gender, your ethnicity, your race, anything like that, you cannot be discriminated against on that basis. And if you are, that constitutes landlord harassment. And you can also go to Human Rights Tribunal for that, which is a separate legal entity in Ontario that issues payouts for human rights abuses, for example. Your landlord can also, something that constitutes harassment is trying to prevent you from joining a tenants association or from organizing one. A landlord can't enter your unit without permission, nor can they give your personal information to someone. In some cases, what you'll need to do even is contact the police is what's legally recommended if it is quite serious. In other cases, you'll need to contact a lawyer and explain the situation. But there are extreme cases, oh, sorry, I flipped ahead by accident. There are extreme cases and your landlord can actually be fined a significant amount of money if they are harassing you. I believe it's up to $100,000. So there are significant penalties for this. And if you know that, you can leverage that against your landlord and be like, hey, stop doing this. I know my rights. I'll make you pay, because that's the only motivating factor for some landlords. We also know at OVCO, a lot of people have had to deal with pests. Is there anyone in here that's dealt with that? Again, unfortunately, a non-zero number of people raising their hands. Any number more than 0 is a big deal. So the thing I will say about this, there's a lot to talk about here. Landlords are always responsible for ensuring your units are free of pests. Mild exceptions being like, if you bring in if you leave out a bunch of fruit when you go on vacation and fruit flies are there when you get back, it's probably not going to be enforced by property standards. But even if something is the responsibility or the fault of a tenant, for example, if your neighbor does that and then the fruit flies get into your unit, the landlord still needs to ensure your unit is clean of them. In a lot of cases too, I know in this community, there's a lot of buildings that are underserved that have damages. So you can see cockroaches and rats have entrance points and become pests in there. So this is a big issue in our community, but any pests that gets into your unit, your landlord needs to ensure that they're dealt with. So they need to eliminate the pests. I'm actually going to go over this entire checklist if everyone's okay with that, just because I know this is something that has happened in our community. I know there's something happening in our community, and it's something that really does generally seriously adversely affect people's enjoyment of their life, their safety, their health. So your landlord needs to eliminate the pests. They also need to prevent their spread to other portions of the property. In addition to that, once they know there are pests, they need to inspect common areas. They need to do this at least once every month, as well as the entirety of the property within 72 hours of receiving information about there being pests on the property. Excuse me. If it's required, they also need to hire a professional that will clean the entire area within 72 hours. So this needs to happen. And if it gets to it, they also need to keep pest management records, post those on common areas. Common areas in apartment buildings are usually in, for example, the laundry rooms or the entrance points of buildings. And this is a big one that gets broken a lot. You can't rent units with pests in them to new tenants. You just simply cannot do that. So the thing to note about this is that it's very common for landlords to be very lazy, drag their heels on this. If anything on this checklist doesn't happen, you can call property standards immediately and have them have an inspector out there, make sure everything's up to snuff, and they can issue work orders. It's not necessarily the only way to deal with this, but it's something you can do if this does happen. The one exception you should know as a tenant is that if there are pests in your unit, you need to allow your landlord to come in and actually deal with that. It seems obvious, but if there are pests, you need to let someone come in and remove them. So you need to be aware of that in your unit. Evictions are kind of oh, sorry, there's a question at the back. Yes.
I don't know how well you can see the slide. Right? So, the lights above you or something like that.
Would people prefer if we tried turning these lights off? We have pot lights over here we can turn on. That might be better. Does anyone want to try that? Yeah.
Or whatever. I don't know.
Here, we're getting mood lighting in here. Bill, I think the light switch is actually on your end if you can find it. Yeah.
I was wondering about water quality. So some of the buildings in this area have really old pipes. And I remember some report came out a couple of years ago about I don't know if it was lead in particular or what, but the lead content in the water in various various areas in the city, and it's actually quite bad here according to that map. You can Google it and find, I think it's a Toronto Star article with a map, and so that's something I've always been concerned about, the water quality in my building, because even as I moved in, I was told that the pipes are really, really old, and so I was wondering about if we had any threats around the quality of the water in our apartments, especially due to pipes being old. If it's not an infrastructural issue.
Oh, sorry.
I have a comment to that, because I know years ago I had called 311.
Yeah.
And there's a test that the city can do, but it's only for people who live in a house.
Yes.
So you can't get it if you live in a building. And
Yes.
there was nothing else I could do, and I was really shocked that it's only for people who own a house.
And water quality tests, when I looked into them, they're all around $50 or so to test your water. So that doesn't seem fair to me. We're right, and I didn't know. I haven't done my due diligence for that.
Right. So I'll just kind of reiterate that for Zoom really quickly. One person was saying that water quality in the pipes themselves are actually quite low. Oh, sorry, there's someone at the back. Would you like to? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were signaling you had a question. My apologies. Yeah, just to reiterate, the question was someone was asking about the pipe quality itself being low to the point where there's a very high concentration of lead, potentially unsafely so in apartment buildings. And someone else followed up with a comment saying that if you call 311 in Toronto, actually they only do water quality tests in homes and not apartment buildings. So yeah, this is a very significant issue. This is a very sincere issue. What I will say about this is that we live under a lot of different bureaucracies, and there's a lot of cracks that we sometimes fall into. The recommendation I would have here, because I don't know if the RTA has something about this, is there's two things you could do. The first is contact a legal clinic and explain your situation, and they might be able to get you in contact with someone that knows more about the RTA and if it covers this, and if so, how. Again, like the RTA it's a big set of laws. I won't pretend to be an expert. I've tried to do my research and be as knowledgeable as I can for this, but I'm not a lawyer. So everything I'm saying here is not legal advice. And it's very difficult to really have a good understanding of what the RTA does, like what it says versus what's enforceable too. A lot of the times the law, especially like the RTA, will say something, but it oftentimes won't even be worth actually going through to see that you get your rights met. What I will suggest to you is legal clinics can sometimes take time. If you have this issue, you should probably contact a city councillor. For anyone that lives within the OVCO map, If you'll recall that, our counselor is Josh Matlow. He's actually pretty good about tenant rights. I've been in a meeting with him trying to organize a tenant association. It was a Zoom meeting trying to organize a tenant association at 99 Vaughan Road. He came out, he gave some feedback, he gave his opinion on the need for tenant associations, how to help. Sometimes city councilors can actually try and get like an inspector out to your building, and based on that, I don't know the actual law in this case, but I would suspect that based on the water quality, based on the tests they do, there might be some city guidelines or mandates that say the water quality is so poor that a work order needs to be issued. I hope that helps, like in terms of now and long term. But yeah, that's the best answer I can give. So yeah, the next thing we're gonna talk about is evictions. This is an incredibly important issue. I don't even want to ask anyone if they've been threatened with eviction, because there is a stigma around that. But I will say there is absolutely no shame in being threatened with an eviction, because we all know what landlords can be like. A lot of the time they're frivolous, and that's why we have this slide up here, because they can be fought. Sorry, yeah, there's a question.
Yeah, I have one. My son went and signed up for parking. They told talking to me about it, and the landlord they give him the right for the parking, and then he failed not to pay, and then they send the bill to me. And when I refuse to pay, they take me to court for that. And he ended up paying it out, but they threatened me the next time he didn't pay, they're going to evict me from the apartment.
So just to reiterate for Zoom, a person has a family member that's paying for parking. That person, I believe, moved out. Is that correct? Or it stopped?
He's still there.
Okay, still.
But, he had to pay out, I think, 2 months parking was owing them. So he refused to pay after they sending lots of letters they sent to him. He didn't pay it, and then they take me to court because they said I am the one he's living with, so I'm responsible for the paying of the parking. And if he didn't pay, that they're going to evict me out of my apartment, even though I was
Okay.
paying my.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying. So just for people on Zoom, this person's son that is living with them stopped paying parking. They didn't pay out the last 2 months. The landlord took this person to court and is threatening to evict them if they don't pay. This is not something I believe you can legally be evicted for. I don't want to say that as legal advice, and I would strongly recommend anytime there's anything coming up with eviction, you should immediately contact legal advice. So we will, in the next section of the slide, we'll be getting to where you can access that, resources for that, as well as different institutions that can give you, like actual legal help and things like that. So again, this is not legal advice. This is just something that it sounds very much like, from my relatively basic, admittedly, understanding of the law, that you should never be able to be evicted for that. I haven't heard of that happening before, especially in this case, because you haven't signed the contract for payment. So there are very specific things you can be evicted for. I don't know if that's one of them, especially since you're not the one on the contract for parking. And yes, sir, you have a question?
No, I just.
Or a
wanted to
comment, yeah.
Yeah, pretty much, I assume you're the leaseholder.
Yeah.
So because you were the leaseholder, you're now responsible, right? And that's why you got the eviction, right?
No,
Because he's not the
they
leaseholder.
threatened me with it.
Yeah, they threatened, they
Yeah.
threatened you, so that you're not, so he's not the leaseholder, you are. And so therefore it falls under the leaseholder. So I just wanted to
Thank you for
clarify.
clarifying. Thank you.
Another one, if I didn't sign over my lease, so I go by month to month. And they send a note under my door that the rent is going up January the 1st, 2022. So I called and I said, but I came in here in July of 2007. And the answer I get, it doesn't matter, they could raise my rent anytime. Since they didn't raise it last year, so they could raise it anytime.
Yes, everybody in my building, sorry, everybody in my building, which is about 100 units, we all got a letter saying comes January 1st, the rent will go up. because, in 2022, now regardless of the date that you do.
Has to be so, because it has to be when your renewal of
So,
your lease comes
is
out.
there anything that I can find?
Okay, so sorry, I'm going to interject really quickly just because I want to be conscious of everyone's time. I do want us to have a good conversation, but as mentioned on the itinerary, we will be having more longer discussion periods and question and answer periods. So just to be clear for people on Zoom, we actually had a very good discussion, healthy discussion where people shared their experiences. A very common experience is illegal above guideline rent increases. So we kind of discussed that earlier. Later in the presentation, we're going to see exactly what to do when that happens legally, the pathway to kind of fight that. So is everyone okay if we move on then and we can kind of keep this for the discussion period, just because I want to be conscious of people on Zoom's time and everyone else in the room? Cool. Okay. Thanks for that. Sorry to interrupt. I do want this to be interactive, but we do need to kind of find a good balance. Pardon me? Yeah, thank you. So evictions, back to these, you can never be evicted, ever, regardless of what your landlord says, without an order from the landlord tenant board. This is always required. And if you were to be evicted and the landlord tenant board issues an eviction notice, the sheriff needs to be the person that evicts you. These are very important things to know. If your landlord's locked you out, is threatening to evict you, you should be getting legal help immediately, like immediately. There's a lot of things to know here. The law isn't necessarily on tenants' sides when it comes to evictions, but you are permitted a lot of time between the notice, and then if you do decide to fight the eviction, you get more time between the notice and the hearing at the landlord tenant board. And then if the landlord tenant board does issue a hearing saying that, or does make an issue saying you're to be evicted, you get a bit of time after that too before you actually need to move out. So from the moment that your landlord says, I'm going to try and evict you, you actually do have a decent amount of time to fight it, to get things in order. So if you are issued an eviction notice, just take a breath. Like there's things that can be done about it. So that's really the second point. You don't need to move out if you get an eviction notice. This applies to everyone. Everyone's covered by this law. Doesn't matter if you're an immigrant. It doesn't matter if you're a permanent resident. It doesn't matter if you're out of prison. This applies to every single person. So I'm going to flip to the next slide really quickly. As I mentioned, there are different reasons you can be evicted, and there are actually different timelines for notice before you're evicted that need to be given. So if you owe rent, if you pay monthly and you owe rent, and your landlord says you haven't paid me in a sufficiently long amount of time, I'm going to evict you, you get 14 days notice. So your landlord can say, you've stopped paying me rent, 14 days from now, you need to move out. And if you decide to fight that, 14 days after they say you need to move out, then they go to the landlord tenant board, file with the landlord tenant board, then they get the hearing, and you'll go to the hearing. That's generally the process. You can see some other cases here. If you're making or selling a drug that's illegally so, you get 10 days notice. If your landlord wants to have a family member move in to replace you, this is more common for people living in homes, you get a full 60 days. If your landlord is trying to rent evict you is the term, which means they're trying to tear down the building and use it for something else, or to renovate it so that they can, raise the rent because it's going to be a quote unquote nicer place. You were given 120 days of notice in that case. And again, then they get the order from the landlord tenant board. So I'm just going to go back to this slide. If you do wind up getting a notice, do go to the landlord tenant board hearing. You will need to go to that hearing. They can hold the hearing without you there and issue an eviction notice without you there. So the only reason to not go is if you're planning on moving out anyway. If you're just planning on saying, I don't care, I don't want to fight this. If for any reason you want to stay, you'll need to go to the hearing. Otherwise, they can make an issue to evict you, and it can be on bogus charges, and you won't have a chance to defend yourself if you don't go. You can bring evidence to say why you shouldn't be evicted. There's some cases where people have been accused of damaging something and it's simply not their fault, and they can bring evidence saying, this isn't my fault, you can't evict me for this. This has happened before. It will almost certainly happen again. It's unfortunate. It's wrong. It's downright wrong, but it does happen. So this is what you do if that does happen. And here again is the timelines just for your reference. One thing that is very important for us at OVCO, we believe tenant associations are a very powerful tool for people to be able to advocate for themselves and to be able to resist illegal actions by landlords, is tenant associations. It is always your legal right to be a part of a tenant association and to organize one in your building. And this applies to everyone. As I mentioned before, if you're an immigrant, if you have permanent residency or not, you can be in a tenant association regardless of what your landlord says. Always. If you're a student, if you're a senior, if you've been in prison before, if you're 20, if you're 30, there's no reason you can't be in a tenant association. And more importantly, your landlord cannot harass you for participating in one. So examples of harassment we've been over, just threats of eviction, of rent increases, threats or attempts rather, threatening to not make repairs explicitly because of your involvement. These are all very illegal. Just to reiterate again, you will always have these rights. And if your tenant does harass you, the fine for harassment is up to $100,000, again, under the Residential Tenancies Act. If you are being harassed, the specific section in the RTA to look up is section 238. And individuals such as the superintendent can face fines individually up to $25,000 for harassing you. And now, very important, we're going to talk about how to actually exercise them. Excuse me. Oh, so we're going to talk about the first steps to do when you have an issue. As I mentioned, like the Residential Tenancies Act is a big piece of legislature. It's very hard to know when you're actually covered in some cases. So the first thing I would recommend doing if you think you have an issue is to actually do a bit of research. And there's different ways to do this. I've included 3 resources here. It's included in the slide deck too. And also just for reference, this is one of the first times there's actually like a link in the presentation. So I just want to be absolutely clear. You can find the slide deck online afterwards. Please just follow us on any of the things, or you can send us an email and we'll be able to get it to you. But the first thing I would recommend is always, just to make sure you can get your rights met, record as much correspondence with your landlord as possible. Try and have everything in writing, either on email or text. And that'll make it easier for you to actually get your rights met. And it'll also make it harder for your landlord to do something illegal, because they'll know that there's an actual record of what you're talking about. So if you do think you have an issue, the first link here is from an organization called CLEO, the Community Legal Education Ontario. They do a really good job of putting together information packages on different parts of law in Ontario. They have a topic on housing law. A lot of the content will be relatively similar to this presentation, but it's also more comprehensive, so you might find that useful. There is also on Facebook, there's a tenant rights group. It's free to join. You can post very detailed accounts of your specific issue. And there's a very broad base of people there. There's a lot of people that are very competent in what they do and experts in the law. So they can give you information on what your rights are and how to actually, meet those rights, get those rights met, pardon me. There's also FMTA, the Federation of Metro Tenant Associations. This is a fantastic nonprofit in Toronto. Their website is below. They have a hotline you can call, explain your situation, and they'll either give you an answer on the spot or take a message and contact either a lawyer or do some research and get back to you. I strongly recommend reaching out to any and all of these if you think you have an issue and you're not sure what to do. I want to reiterate too that, again, nothing I'm giving is legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. In a lot of cases, even the links here won't be legal advice, but if it's not actual advice on what to do, it'll be advice on very clearly where to get the advice you need, who to talk to, be it a lawyer, be it someone at the landlord tenant board. These resources are all quite helpful. I found that in my own personal experience too. So we talked about legal clinics. Legal clinics are really interesting in this city. There's a very wide berth of them. Some are better and some are worse, unfortunately. The first link here is a tool to find the one closest to you. In some cases, you'll find multiple. It's hard in some cases to know which one's best. I believe in our community, we're entitled to 2 different legal clinics based on our proximity. Each one's about 7.5 kilometers away. You can call them up. and see what's up. Different legal clinics will help you based on different reasons. There's at least one legal clinic in Ontario or Toronto, pardon me, that will help you based on, for example, if you're a homeless youth. There are others, if your income is below a certain threshold. There's actually one, I believe, that will even offer you help if your income is below a threshold but above another one, because it wants to make sure that people that are slightly too wealthy to afford the ones for very poor people can still have some legal representation, because a lot of legal clinics are for only the very poorest people, which is good and bad, unfortunately. Legal clinics in general, to be clear, are underfunded. This is not meant to be a political statement. This is not pro or con on the Ford government. This is a very simple statement of fact, is that they've had their services cut recently. And I know personally, a lot of people are unfortunately feeling the consequences of that and being underserved as a consequence too. We've mentioned property standards. I'll be a bit more specific on the role of property standards. If your landlord refuses to make repairs when you have an issue on something that they're legally obligated to make repairs on, or if they make repairs inadequately, what you can do is call a property standards inspector. Their contact information is also on here. You can call 311 like on your phone, or you can email 311@toronto.ca. What they can do is send a property standards inspector to your unit to issue a work order. So they can't help for things like evictions. They can't help for illegal rent increases. They can't issue a work order to make sure a handy person comes in and, like, you know, protects you from your landlord harassing you. They can't do that, but they can issue a work order to get a handy person to come in and fix your plumbing, for example. There's also more information at the link below that gives you a bit of a clear understanding of when you can and can't, or when you should and shouldn't call property standards. So just to be clear on when you should call them, hope everyone can read this. If not, it should be on your the printouts that you have. If the air conditioning came with your unit, then that's a landlord's responsibility. And if they're not fixing it, you can call property standards. Common areas, if there's pets, for example, if there's a lack of hot water. Property standards, one thing I'll say about them too is that in a lot of cases, I personally have experienced this. If you're living in a unit that has very low ceilings, for example, or very small rooms, there are actually legal minimums in the city for what your room should look like. You know, we're human beings. We should have entitlements to a reasonable space to live. You can't rent a 2 square foot room. So some cases, if your ceiling's too low or something like that, property standards can actually come in and make sure that the room size minimums are met, which is a very important term. Things like ventilation, stairs or handrails, also snow clearing. It's the landlord's responsibility to clear snow and cut the grass. So if they're not doing that, especially snow clearing, can actually be a safety issue, especially now that the weather is taking a downturn. The landlord tenant board has been alluded to before. This is my least favorite slide in the presentation, to be honest, because there's so much to say about the landlord tenant board. And it's very hard in a lot of cases to know when to contact them. There was a person on break, for example, we were chatting and talking about above guideline rent increases. And if you have an above guideline rent increase, that will ultimately go to the landlord tenant board if it does escalate that far. But the problem with the landlord tenant board is that, for example, it costs $40 to file. So in this person's case, their rent was about $1,000. And their landlord was trying to get them to pay rent 4 months earlier than they were legally obligated to. So the rent overpayment would have been about $50, but filing with the landlord tenant board is $40. So this is one of the gaps in the system where there's no winners. Tenants get screwed. Is it actually worth the time for a person really to go through all that effort to save what lands up being $10? So that's not to say you shouldn't fight it. There are other ways to fight an above guideline rent increase. It's just an example of quite honestly, the failings of the system. So the landlord tenant board, oftentimes you go there as the final destination in trying to get your rights met. In many cases, it will always cover evictions. It will always cover rent disputes and harassment. Like, these are things that will always go down eventually to the landlord tenant board, but not necessarily always, for example, for other issues. one thing I'll say too is that the landlord tenant board's role in legal terms from their own website is to, quote, resolve disputes between tenants and landlords. Their job is not to make sure you have hot water. It's to resolve dispute when you say you deserve hot water and your landlord says, I don't want to fix that for you. So this is kind of a big deal. If you do wind up really needing something, you might need to go to the landlord tenant board. And certainly I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm saying it is unfortunately a very big deal, and you should just be aware of everything that's involved in all of this. I'll give one more brief story. In Parkdale, actually, a few years ago, there was an apartment building that had decaying balconies. Like the balconies were really damaged and they were getting unsafe. And the tenants wanted this fixed for a while. And one day the landlord decided that they were just going to tear everything down. All the balconies got torn down. The tenants were given less than a week notice. And the tenants eventually wound up getting together and saying, we deserve a rent reduction of 10% because part of our rent was going towards paying the balconies. The issue escalated. Eventually, it actually went to the landlord tenant board, and the landlord tenant board agreed that, you know, balconies are part of the essential services you're paying for, and agreed with the 10% rent reduction. And the tenants in this case actually got back pay. So the reason I'm bringing this story up is not to say if your balconies get torn down, go to the landlord tenant board. Again, I'm not saying don't do that. I'm saying that the landlord tenants board reach is quite broad. They do a lot of different things like this. And if you do ever think you need to go to landlord tenant board, you should probably be seeking legal help before you go there, is my one recommendation. It's kind of a big deal, unfortunately. It shouldn't be, but we need to recognize as tenants that it is. So we're going to talk to about help politicians. Oh, yes, sir, we have a question.
It's regarding this balcony.
Yeah.
We does our landlord, the operation from the city last October, actually that they started without having permission, but our tenant association found out that the didn't have the permission when it started, because she researched and found out that they did not have. But then what happened is that happened in October, and it almost took a year to finish it. Now, we were already moved in because of COVID, and when the air, when the atmosphere changed, and we really needed budget to come out with that. It took almost a year, and I have the feeling that I should not pay for all that month of full payment, because part of the area I rented was broken. They just shut it from outside on us, and we can't even open the basket for almost a year. So I was I had the question. I raised the question to my association if these things illegal or illegal. I am not supposed to pay full rent. If I don't pay some $50 or $30 less, I know that they will make a big deal and come out of the building. How about me renting all that space and not using it for so many years? Is there anything that could the experience of the past operations there for packaging up? Because I'm still I still want to follow up on this. But I really don't feel that.
If you feel comfortable sharing, would you mind telling me what building you live in the community? 441. Okay. Okay, so this is quite good. So just for people on Zoom, a person here resonated with the balcony story. They were not able to use their balcony for a year during COVID due to repairs. And they, I believe, rightly feel as though they shouldn't have to have paid full rent for that year when they couldn't use something that they were paying for in their building. So this is, I don't want to say a tough question to answer. I'm saying that it's a tough thing to see justice on. Not to say you shouldn't, but the case in Parkdale had a very strong tenants association. So all the tenants came together and made this a priority for themselves. And everyone jointly filed as the tenant association on everyone's behalf. I do know Prophetess. She's the chair of the Tenant Association at 440. She will be speaking during this presentation. So just a premature introduction. But one thing I will say is that this is something a tenant association can take on, but it needs to be a very strong and robust tenant association. So it's very hard to do this individually. And even for your case, you would have to put on a lot of work on your own shoulders, file $40 for, you might make back 10 times that much. And don't get me wrong, $400 is a significant amount of money for a person. It is for me, at least. It is for most tenants, I would assume. But the amount of time you would need to do just in terms of legal research, in terms of documentation, it's not, I don't want to say it's not worth it for an individual, but it's certainly much easier to do with a bunch of people. It's easier for everyone to do collectively, and it also gives the case much more legitimacy in the eyes of the landlord tenant board. So if I were you, honestly, the best thing I could recommend, you could try contacting the legal clinic and explaining the situation to them. You could try filing with the landlord tenant board individually. What I would strongly recommend doing is getting as involved with your tenant association as possible, and trying to work something out for everyone in your building, because it will make it easier for everyone in the building, and it will give your case a lot more legitimacy. And there was another question.
No, I just want to comment on that. They will use COVID as an excuse because, you know, they couldn't get workers to do it. We were under lockdown. So,
But they started the work, they did the community things and then wait months.
but you know, good luck because everybody's using COVID now as an
Yeah.
excuse. So whatever you cannot get it for, we can't get anybody to COVID, you know, we cannot get companies to deliver or companies to work. I have seen that in the building.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And just for people on Zoom, for reference, someone brought up the fact that a lot of the times, especially over the past year when this occurred for this person, the landlords will use the excuse of COVID was an issue in terms of hiring people to do the work, which is true to a certain extent. But certainly, I think you should have access to your balconies, to put it gently.
They'll come up with more reasons
Mhm.
more than that.
But actually, that's a really good segue into our next conversation, because again, you could actually contact a local politician about this and explain your situation, and they might be able to help you. As I mentioned, Josh Matlow is the city councilor. So really quickly, there's only the city councilor and provincial MPP, pardon me, listed here. I don't have any strong or negative feelings towards our member of parliament, but housing falls at the city and provincial level, so there's no real value, generally speaking, to call up your member of parliament. Our city councilor, Josh Matlow, his his website is here. He doesn't have an email. He has a contact form on his website, and the phone number is listed there. So again, sometimes if you have an issue, you can call them up. I've tried to deal with property standards before, and I dealt with an issue where they were taking a long time to come to me, and I had serious issues that need dealt with. In cases like that, sometimes you can even call up your counselor and they can really advocate on your behalf, and in some cases outright just tell property standards inspectors, you need to go to this unit as soon as possible because they have a sincere issue. They can also, in some cases, just give you advice, tell you what legal clinics in the area you're entitled to, things of that nature. And again, like Josh Matlow is actually pretty good on tenant rights issues. He has been trying to help people form a tenants association. He's put forth some pro-tenant legislation in city council. So he would be, for people that live in this community, he'd be a good person to contact. Jill Andrew is our member of provincial parliament. Her email is here. Her website that you can contact her at is here, as well as her phone number. One thing I will say too about Jill Andrew is that we're lucky to live in a community that has a city councilor and MPP that are both in the courtroom of tenants, so to speak. Their ball's in our courts. Jill Andrew, pardon me, not Andrews, has put together a package. I've seen it before. Unfortunately, I couldn't acquire any for this presentation, but it's like a know your rights leaflet for tenants to exercise their rights. So yeah, we do have two politicians that represent us that do a decent job of tenant rights. And if you have an issue, you know, I would say if you think it might help, give them a call, send them an email. The worst thing they can do is say, no, I can't help you. But the best thing they can do, best case scenario, they might actually be able to help you with your issue. We've jumped around the topic of tenant associations. At OVCO, we strongly believe they're one of the best ways for tenants to not only advocate on their own behalf, but also actually see their rights met. If you are part of a tenant association, the tenant association can advocate on your behalf. In some cases, even provide legal help in stronger tenant associations cases. For a lot of buildings, it creates a sense of community and can host events like barbecues or things of that nature. The existence of a tenant association itself is very powerful. It signals to the landlord that there is going to be some institution that's going to fight you if you try illegal things, such as above guideline rent increases to an entire unit. It's just harder to do that when there's a tenant association because everyone guaranteed, because of the tenant association's existence, will know, actually, I can't do this. And then the tenant association can advocate on everyone's behalf. If anyone doesn't know what a tenant association is, we'll talk about that in a second in more detail, but it's similar to how a union represents workers, tenant associations represent tenants. And again, they're one of the best ways to exercise your rights. I'll give one quick example, and then we're gonna do a quick break. People can get snacks, use the washroom, do a Q&A. But I'll give an example about rent strikes. And I wanna be clear that I'm not advocating anyone necessarily do rent strikes. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying be aware of the risk and the dangers involved. If you are an individual, you cannot stop paying rent. You can, but you'll get evicted, right? And it won't really accomplish anything in the long run. If everyone in your building stops paying rent, then it becomes a landlord's problem. And you are actually legally entitled to do a rent strike for at least 1 month, as long as it's a coordinated effort. So the reason I bring up rent strikes is because there's something that can only happen when, generally speaking, when a tenant association exists. So the existence of a tenant association also signals to a landlord, hey, there is actually some consequences if you don't do what you're legally obligated to. Like, tenants can actually advocate for themselves. They can take some action. This is a very extreme case, but it's something I think people should know about. And there's just a story here if anyone wants to read. It's just a story about people organizing a rent strike and winning a reduction in their rent after an illegal above guideline rent increase. This happened in Parkdale too. There's a lot of tenant movements in Parkdale. So I just want to, this is a very serious issue. I'm not telling anyone to stop paying rent, but I am saying that this is some mechanism that does exist, that tenant associations create that threat to landlords and really helps swing the power in tenants' favors just a little bit more. Our next topic is tenant associations. I would love to see that excitement from everyone. Not that that's a threat or an order, but yeah, so we're just going to go over what a tenant association is, and we're going to have two speakers really quickly talk about their experience. Hopefully they'll be much more interactive, but that's on the speaker's discretion themselves. So first, we've talked about what a tenant association is. One thing I really want to clarify here, we've mentioned FMTA, the Federation of Metro Tenant Associations. So we mentioned them in terms of they have a hotline in the last section for how to exercise your rights. Now we're going to talk about FMTA because they're the Federation of Metro Tenant Associations, and we're talking about tenant associations. They do a fantastic job of creating, promoting, building tenant associations. They have a toolkit. They have it's a very comprehensive document, very easy and digestible to read, very clear in its advice. So that's linked at the bottom. One excerpt I really want to share, because I think it's really important in how we discuss these things, is that a tenant association has zero legal obligation to be registered with any government agency whatsoever. It doesn't need to have a charity status, pardon me. It doesn't need to belong to a nonprofit entity at all. All a tenant association needs to do to exist is have tenants agree that it should exist. That's really it. So every tenant has the rights to get together with other tenants and form their own associations. There's no requirement that it have a constitution. It doesn't need to be registered or incorporated. The very fact that a tenant association exists makes it a legal entity per the Residential Tenancies Act. It doesn't need approval from the landlord, but it will be easier if you get recognition from the landlord. Oftentimes, one of the first things a tenant association needs to do, the first job, the first organizing effort of a tenant association is to get that recognition. Not always, but oftentimes. So hopefully that helps. Hopefully that gives you some context. Our first speaker is in the audience right now, Prophetess Reid. I'll just give her a really quick introduction. Aside from being a fantastic person, she is the chair of the Tenant Association at 440 Winona Drive, that is, in our community. And she's also on the board of directors for OVCO. So she does a lot of fantastic work. I'm very happy that she had the time to be here today. Her resume was long, so I left these two very relevant things on there, but she does a lot of other community work that she can speak to if she wants, and I think she should plug those things. So yeah, please, Prophetess, come up. I'll just turn the microphone on for you.
Oh, my goodness.
Thanks so much for speaking.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. Is it on?
It should be on, yeah.
Okay. So I'm the Tenant Association Chair for 440. I ended up by default being getting involved because I was just tired of hearing about a lot of human rights violation and just, tenants not being treated right. And it just brought me back to childhood where when my father came to this country in 1970 and he would want to rent. And by the time he showed up, it was like, there's nothing here to rent. And so it just brought me back. And then, new immigrants, the building I live on, there's a lot of newcomers from other countries, and they just didn't understand the law and just the way in which that they were being treated was just so disrespectful. And so I got involved by being that voice. And I got involved by having a meeting and hearing their issues, and they listed them from illegal evictions, an N5 to pest control. Some of them were paying for maintenance that was the landlord's responsibility. And so I was able to get some of them I got refunds for them so that they reversed those payments, and just a lot of illegal things that they were doing. We had a superintendent was very racist and bullying, very disrespectful, and treated our tenants really, really bad. And so eventually he's no longer with us. And so that's the power of a tenant association. You hold the landlord accountable. And unity is strong. And numbers, you can't do this by yourself, because when you do this by yourself, you're not taken seriously. But when it's a collective movement, there's so much you could do, and then they will listen. They didn't listen to us until Jill Andrews came to our apartment, got a whole list of our complaints, and then it was spoken about in Queens Park. And all of a sudden, there is now a conversation with the landlord. So things are better. There's always room for improvement, but your voice, I want to say one thing, your voice matter. I'm not really a public speaker, but I just felt that I had to step up to the plate to speak to those injustices. And so it's so important that never feel that you have to have the knowledge to do it, because I'm still learning. And I couldn't have done this, believe it or not, without the backing and the support of OVCO. fantastic organization. And we've got stellar people there who supported. So they were there for me when I didn't know what I was doing. So it's so important that you have support. And it's so important that we all get involved, because if you see something, you got to say something, right? And it's really important because new immigrants, for example, they think that they don't have a voice. And they believe, coming from their country, to hear the landlord tells the truth. And so it's really important that we speak up for them and then support them, and to ensure that everyone's rights is valued regardless of where our background is. And so it's so important for that. And so I want to take a moment, and is there any questions that anyone may have?
Can I ask a question from Zoom?
What makes the Tenant Association healthiest?
Wow, a good team, and just have people willing to do a little bit of work. Like, for example, I was able to mobilize, like, for flyering, for example, which is a lot of work. On each floor, we have a rep, and it's just something that starts there. I'm not too sure if I answered your question. Yes.
What is the day-to-day?
Pardon?
Like, what does it look like on a, like, from day to day, or, what are you doing on, like, a weekly basis?
In terms of hours?
Yeah, not even hours. Yes, hours, but also, what does it entail?
Oh, wow. Let's see. So, meeting with the landlord, for example, to address tenants' issue as they arise, such as elevator breakdown, right? And just really addressing the tenant. So you'll be the voice, you become the voice for the collective. How's that? And you're the one that they speak to instead of them going individually. Yes, Alex.
When you started organizing, were other tenants like skeptical, or were people?
You know what? People were skeptical, but when they saw things being moved and things getting done, they were now all on board, And so it's so important. I think people tend to look for action, right? Because they've seen it on, when situation went nowhere, but we were really getting action. And, I have to say this, our politicians in this area, they're stellar. Josh Mathlow came out, Carolyn Bennett came out, Jill Andrews came out. So it's so important to have the support, and we do have that support. Oh,
I just
sorry.
remembered the people on Zoom.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Zoom. Any other questions?
You can hand it off to Bill if that's everyone.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. Thank you so much for speaking.
Thank you.
Some of us on Zoom wanted to ask.
I probably shouldn't clap holding the microphone, but yeah, one thing I'll just try. I don't want to answer any questions on behalf of anyone else, but just to clarify for people that might not know, Prophetess is currently, I believe, one of the only people working on this tenant association. So her experience might look different on a day-to-day. I would expect other tenant associations would have more like meetings, for example, to address issues and get together. And also just on that note, like as Prophetess was saying, like if we really want a healthy tenant association, even 1 hour a month from every person can really make all the difference. Even as, like for a lot of people here, I'm assuming you saw leaflets. I was the one that put that under your door. I hope you don't mind me making a little bit of a mess. I was only trying to help, I promise. But yeah, that took me quite a bit of time. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that like even having one person give 1 hour a month on every floor to do that on Prophetess's behalf can really make quite a big difference in terms of how these things work. So I just wanted to add that. But I thought, yeah, thank you so much for speaking. I thought that was great.
And I also want to thank you because I didn't have a clue
Yeah, we met in the lobby. Yeah.
Yeah, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. So next up is Bill Worrell. I'll just give him a quick introduction. He is also on the board of director of OVCO. It's not a coincidence. It's much easier to get people to speak when they're already in your organization, but he still is incredibly qualified to speak. One of the reasons he's on OVCO is because of his experience. In 1987, he worked to establish a tenant association in our community too. And now, as mentioned, he's a board of director on OVCO. So without further ado, thank you so much. Here's Bill.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
I'm supposed to stand in front of the computer or?
Wherever you prefer. I'll
Okay.
move it. Stand where you're comfortable, and I'll make
Okay.
sure people on Zoom can see you.
Okay. Yeah, so Lauder Avenue is, it's kind of closer to Dufferin. And 640 Lauder is just south of Vaughan Road. You might see, when you're going along Vaughan Road, you can see the building there. There's another building on North Cliff that's kind of close by. Anyway, yeah, so basically what happened was that our building is like a lot of buildings in our community. A lot of people, newcomers, people who've lived there a long time, people who just moved in, young, old. It was a real mix of people. And one day I was having a real problem with getting a repair done in my apartment. And I happened to know another family in the building because we both had the kids in the same daycare, right? So we were picking up our kids at the daycare, and I said, you know, hey Pablo, what are we going to do about this? And we started talking about starting a tenant association. So it started with 2 people. So we decided that we were going to start a tenant association, and so the first thing we did was that I started hanging around in the lobby just for a few minutes during rush hour and just asking people, you know, what's going on in your building. I started to hear stories, right? So we did a flyer and we handed it out to everybody in the building, and we said, we're going to have a meeting in the lobby, because at that point, you know, your superintendent, sometimes they can be your best friend or your worst enemy. So at that particular time, the superintendent was actually kind of supportive of the idea, because he figured if tenants stop complaining to him, his job gets easier, right? So not all superintendents think like that. But anyway, so we had a little meeting in the lobby, and it was like 5 people. But you know what? It's 80 units, and it's got 8 floors. So if we had 5 people, we had 5 floors covered, right? Like we had 1 person on each floor. So, so we started hearing about all kinds of issues. And then the issue that really brought people out is that the front door to the building wasn't locking. So people could come and go however they wanted. And people started hearing stories about, you know, people wandering around the halls and checking the doorknobs and stuff. And the landlord was not fixing it. So we called another meeting, and that meeting, we got about 20 people, right? And again, it was in the lobby. This is way before COVID. So, so after a few meetings like this, we decided to set up a tenants association. We got support from our local politician who gave us all kinds of advice about how to do that. And we actually knocked on everybody's door in the building and asked them if they wanted to join the Tenants Association. I don't know if that's the way you do things now. This was quite a while ago. And we had little membership cards, you know, like when you join a club and you get a card, and people would sign the card, and we actually had dues. We said, $5 a year, can you afford it, right? Because when people pay dues, it means they really belong to something, right? So we became this official organization. And if, you know what, if somebody couldn't pay, I just took $5 out of my pocket and paid for them. Like not in front of him, but in front of them, but just to do it, right? Anyway, so we had a little bit of money to print flyers and stuff. And we set up an executive. So we had me and my friend, my daycare buddy, we were co-chairs, and we had a secretary and a treasurer. Not that the treasurer had much to do, but anyway. And so we ended up fighting a lot of battles over 2 years. And we stopped a couple of evictions. We got roaches dealt with in we actually organized a bit of a strike around roaches, because what the landlord did, this is back in the day when they had garbage chutes where you threw the garbage down a chute. And so the landlord said, there's too many roaches in the building, we're going to close down the garbage chutes. So what we would do is we organized a campaign where everybody took their bag of garbage and dropped it, not in the bin in the parking lot, but outside the bin, so that the super had to come out and throw all these bags of garbage into the bin. It was like it was an action. It was a way to unify people around some kind of action, right? We had garage doors problems not working. I heard another garage door story tonight. So we dealt with a lot of issues around those kind of things. So in the end, we had about 75% of the members of that building signed it up as members of the tenant association. So when we met with the landlord, they knew that there was a lot of people behind us, right? So anyway, we won a lot of battles and back in those days. So just a couple of lessons that I learned from that whole experience. When you start winning battles, and all the things that David talked about and the Prophetess talked about is true. Like once the city knows that you're going to call them about a repair, they start designating a staff. I actually started developing a friendship with one of these inspectors because we got really well known. All of a sudden she was coming like every month and she had like 5 work orders. So once you win victories, people who are scared, they come out. They say, hey, like you wouldn't believe some of the stories I heard. I'll give you one horror story. We finally were able to connect with an elderly woman. She was probably in her 80s. And she had lived there for like 40 years or something, 30 years. She, her toilet had been broken for 6 months. Every time she had to go to the bathroom, she had to go to the neighbors. She had asked the landlord for 6 months to get it fixed. And the landlord just figured she's going to move out soon anyway, so I'm not going to bother, right? Anyway, that's the most extreme story. But once you start winning victories, people get more courageous and they come forward. And even when you're strong, not everybody's going to agree with you, and that's okay. Like as long as you're doing things that you know is good for the majority, that's what's important. Yeah, I already talked about the super, I guess. And finally, it really does build community. I don't know if any of you in your buildings, what your experience is, but quite often before the tenant association, you get in the elevator, somebody else get in the elevator, you both stare at the wall, right? And you can hardly wait to get off the elevator because not that you don't like the person, it just doesn't occur to you to talk to them. But once we got this thing going, it was amazing. People were making friends. People were talking to each other. You'd hear all the stories about what's going on in the building. So it really does build a sense of community. And that was one of the things I hadn't actually thought about when I started the Tenants Association. So that's basically what I'd like to say about that. Any questions?
What are the most common issues that you find yourself dealing with?
I would, to my recollection, because it was in 1987. Repairs was a big one. And as you know, as David said, like a lot of tenants don't even know that it's actually the landlord's responsibility to fix that crack in your ceiling, you know? And you don't have to wait until it starts dripping or the plaster starts falling on your head. And once it appears, they're supposed to fix it, right?
Really?
So I would say that was the most common issue. Yeah.
You know, the tenant association there persisted long after you left the building?
That's a good question. I think it. See, I moved out and the co-chair moved out almost within a few months of each other. And I went and visited the building for, I would say for about a year after that it existed, maybe 2 years, I'm not sure. But people told me that things were much better too, so I don't know. Yeah. Anything else? Anyway, yeah, so. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bill.
I will say just well, first of all, thank you so much for speaking, Bill. That was fantastic. And, you know, Bill and I work closely together. I've heard a lot of the story, but even that was like a lot more detail. And I feel like I learned a lot from that too. One thing I will say, just like some concluding remarks, tenant associations don't, for people that might not live in an apartment building, for people on Zoom maybe, tenant associations don't necessarily need to be only in an apartment building. I live in, as I mentioned, a house with 3 other roommates. In the eyes of the law, realistically, we have a tenant association because every time there's an issue, we come together, we talk about it, we're a unified front on these matters. And it's so much easier to navigate anytime an issue with our landlord comes up, knowing that we all have each other's backs, knowing that we're all fighting the same issue for the same reasons, that we're in the right legally and morally, and that we're in it together. So I think this workshop has been great. I'm putting this slide back up here again. Hopefully people have learned something. And if you've learned something and want to get involved in any way, at OVCO as an organization, one of our big goals, especially with the Tenant Solidarity Project, is to help with really forming, you know, tenant associations. If you want to be involved in that in any way, we would love to get in touch with you. Please drop us a line, contact me personally, contact OVCO, and we'll help. One thing I apologize, I forgot this earlier, is that, you know, everything mentioned earlier, with the exception of tenant associations, really is responsive measures. And what I mean by that is, you know, when you exercise your rights, you're responding to something generally. You're saying, there's an issue in my unit, I'm going to respond to this. And this is how I do so with the landlord tenant board, with property standards, so on and so forth. One last thing I'll say is that OVCO also has working groups, and this is a volunteer-led organizations, and it seeks to change public policy and future policy in a way that benefits us as a community. So I would say, if you have the time and the desire, I would highly encourage anyone that can to get involved. It really does help our community in the long term too. So I forgot to plug that, but if you do want to get involved, you can reach out to us anywhere here and we'll get you in contact with the right people. We do have a survey. We're very close to wrapping up, if you could bear with me. If you follow this link, and I can share the Wi-Fi with anyone here if you need it in person, it's a very brief survey. This survey helps us with this workshop, for example. When we host future workshops, this will give us information on what the community actually wants and needs to learn about. This will give us ways to improve our workshops, things that will help you. This also helps us to be, like, full disclosure, a lot of our work is predicated on funding. So we get funding from external funders. And if we have this survey filled out by as many people as possible, we can show them what people have learned, and that actually helps us acquire more funding and show that we're actually doing good work. The last thing I'll say about this survey is that it's completely anonymous, or rather as anonymous as you want it to be. You do need to leave an email. Everything else, you don't need to feel as though you need to put in anything you don't want to. And the only people that will ever see this are me, for example, and other people at OVCO on the board of directors. We will never, ever share your information with anyone else, ever. I'm going to leave this link up here, but I'm just going to say really quickly, this is the last slide in the presentation. An extremely special thanks for the 4 Youth Information for letting us use this space, as well as Dana Bronstetter for her help with the graphic design. She did the graphic design on all of the posters and all of the leaflets. I think they came out fantastic. She's also moderating the Zoom call right now. People in Zoom, please leave a big thanks for her. She's done such a good job and has been so helpful in having this all come together. Thank you so much, Dana. And yeah, for anyone else, here's the link to the survey. You can fill this out whenever. And if it's more incentive, we will be doing a raffle a week from today. We're gonna look at all the emails submitted, and you have a chance to win a $50 gift card for groceries. So hopefully that will help some people. So yeah, thank you all so much for coming. If you have any questions, I'll just be standing up here. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.